The federal courthouse in Boston stood resolute against the morning fog, its granite walls holding secrets that would soon shake everyone inside to their core. What started as a simple custody hearing would spiral into something that no one could have predicted, leaving witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about loyalty, courage, and the extraordinary bond between a soldier and his dog. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the tall windows of Courtroom 7A, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Every seat was taken, the air electric with anticipation, as Master Sergeant James Mitchell sat in his dress blues, the medals on his chest catching what little light filtered through. His weathered hands rested on the wheels of his chair, knuckles white with tension. But it wasn't his impressive military record or his sacrifice that drew all eyes in the room. It was the magnificent Belgian Malinois sitting vigilantly at his side. Shadow, with his deep brown eyes and alert ears, wasn't just any military working dog. His tactical vest bore the same unit insignia as Mitchell's uniform, a reminder of their shared battles in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. The dog's posture mirrored his handler's, proud, resolute, but there was an undercurrent of tension in both of them that seemed to ripple through the crowded courtroom. Judge Eleanor Martinez studied the pair from her bench, her expression carefully neutral despite the unusual nature of the case before her. The Department of Defense wanted Shadow back, claiming he was essential for an upcoming classified operation. They argued that despite Mitchell's distinguished service and his deep bond with Shadow, the dog remained government property. The word property had made Mitchell's jaw clench every time it was mentioned during the preliminary hearings. The gallery was packed with an unusual mix of spectators. Veterans in their service caps sat shoulder to shoulder with civilian supporters, while uniformed military personnel occupied the back rows. Local media sketched furiously in their notepads, prohibited from bringing cameras into the federal courthouse. The story had caught fire across social media. The wounded warrior fighting to keep his four-legged battle companion. Mitchell's attorney, Sarah Chen, arranged her papers at the defense table, her movements precise and measured. She had taken the case pro bono after hearing about Mitchell's situation. As a former JAG officer, she understood both the legal complexities and the human cost of treating military working dogs as equipment rather than the living, breathing heroes they were. Across the aisle, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harrison represented the Department of Defense. His starched uniform and rigid posture embodied the military's unwavering position. Shadow was needed for a critical mission, and regulations clearly stated that military working dogs could be recalled to active duty regardless of their handler's status. The tension in the room crescendoed as Judge Martinez cleared her throat. "Before we begin," she started, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench, "I want to remind everyone that this is a federal courthouse, not a theater. Any outbursts will result in immediate removal." Her eyes swept across the gallery, lingering on the cluster of veterans who had been vocal during previous sessions. Mitchell's hand moved to Shadow's head, fingers brushing through the dog's fur in a gesture that seemed to calm them both. The Belgian Malinois leaned slightly into his touch, their connection palpable even from across the room. They had survived 3 tours together, detected countless IEDs, and saved an entire patrol from an ambush. Now they faced a different kind of battle, one fought with legal precedence instead of bullets. Shadow's ears suddenly twitched, his head turning slightly toward the main doors. The movement was subtle, something only Mitchell seemed to notice. After years of trusting the dog's instincts in combat, he had learned to read every minute change in Shadow's behavior. But this was a courthouse in downtown Boston, not a war zone. Mitchell pushed the concern aside, focusing instead on the judge as she began to speak. "Master Sergeant Mitchell," Judge Martinez addressed him directly, Given the unique circumstances of this case and its implications for future military working dog protocols, I'm offering you an opportunity to address the court before we proceed with arguments. Would you like to make a statement? Mitchell straightened in his wheelchair, his medals catching the light once more. The Purple Heart gleamed prominently among them, a testament to the day that had changed everything, the day Shadow had dragged him to safety after the IED blast, refusing to leave his side despite his own injuries. The same blast that had left Mitchell in the wheelchair, and Shadow with a slight limp that the dog barely showed unless he was tired. As Mitchell prepared to speak, Shadow's posture changed again. The dog's muscles tensed almost imperceptibly, his nose working the air in a way that Mitchell recognized from their time in combat. Something was triggering Shadow's finely tuned senses, something that made the hair on the back of Mitchell's neck stand up. Years of combat experience had taught him to trust these moments of synchronized awareness with his partner. The courtroom waited in anticipation, unaware that this moment, this seemingly routine hearing, was about to take a turn that would test the bounds of loyalty, challenge the definition of duty, and reveal a threat that only Shadow could detect. The bond between handler and dog, forged in the crucible of war, was about to prove its worth in ways no one could have anticipated. Mitchell cleared his throat, his fingers still intertwined in Shadow's fur, as he began to address the court. The words came slowly at first, each one weighted with memories of sand, blood, and unwavering loyalty. Your Honor, Shadow isn't just a military asset. He's the reason 18 soldiers made it home to their families. The courtroom fell silent as Mitchell's voice gained strength, carrying the authority earned through years of command. It was during our second tour in the Korengal Valley. Our patrol had been tracking insurgent movement for 3 days. Shadow had been working twice as hard as any of us, scanning for IEDs, checking buildings, never missing a beat despite the 100-degree heat. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Mitchell continued. This wasn't just another testimony. This was a story of brotherhood that transcended species, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. We were exhausted, running low on water when Shadow's behavior changed. Anyone else might have missed it, but I knew. His ears twitched the same way they're doing right now. A few heads turned toward Shadow, noting how the dog's attention remained. Fixed on the courtroom doors, his body subtly tense, Mitchell pressed on, his voice taking on an edge of urgency that seemed to mirror his companion's alertness. Shadow pulled me off our planned route. Some of the men grumbled. We were all ready to head back to base, but Shadow insisted, and I'd learned to trust him without question. Sarah Chen watched her client carefully, noting how his hand never left Shadow's fur, as if the physical connection helped anchor them both to the present moment. The bond between them was more than just handler and dog. It was a partnership forged through countless life-and-death decisions. 200 meters down the ridge, we found them. A group of children from a nearby village, huddled in a shallow cave. They'd wandered too far following their goats and gotten lost in territory crawling with insurgents. If Shadow hadn't led us to them... Mitchell's voice trailed off, the unspoken consequences hanging heavy in the air. Judge Martinez leaned forward slightly, her usual stoic expression softening. And this was before the incident that led to your injuries? Mitchell nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to his legs. Yes, Your Honor. That came 8 months later, during our third tour together. But what happened that day in the valley? That was when I truly understood that Shadow wasn't just a military working dog. He has an intelligence, an instinct that goes beyond training. Shadow's ears twitched again, more pronouncedly this time. Mitchell felt the subtle shift in the dog's muscles beneath his hand, a tension he recognized from countless missions. But he forced himself to continue, knowing this might be his last chance to keep his partner. The day I was injured, Shadow had been acting strange all morning, agitated. The other handlers suggested he might be getting heat exhaustion, recommended I leave him at base. But I knew his signals. He was trying to tell us something. Mitchell's voice grew thick with emotion. We were clearing a residential area when it happened. The IED was buried deep, undetectable by our equipment. But Shadow knew. He tried to pull me back, but I was too focused on the mission, too stubborn to listen. The gallery was completely still now, every person leaning forward slightly, caught in the gravity of Mitchell's words. Even Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had stopped shuffling his papers, his eyes fixed on the decorated sergeant. The blast caught me in the legs. The medical report said I was thrown 15 feet. Everything after that is fragments. Dust, shouting, the taste of blood. But I remember Shadow. He dragged me 100 yards to safety through active gunfire, took a bullet in his hind leg doing it, never once let go of me. Mitchell's voice cracked slightly. When I woke up in Germany 2 weeks later, he was there. They'd flown him in on the same medical transport. The doctors said his presence helped stabilize my vital signs. Sarah Chen stood, adding to her client's testimony. Your Honor, if I may, the military's own reports confirm that Shadow refused to leave Master Sergeant Mitchell's side during the entire evacuation. He had to be sedated for his own injury treatment. The bond between them quite literally saved my client's life. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison rose to object, but Shadow suddenly let out a low growl, not aggressive but alerting. The sound carried clearly through the hushed courtroom, causing several spectators to shift nervously in their seats. Mitchell's combat-honed instincts flared. He recognized this behavior. Shadow wasn't just uneasy, he was tracking something. Or someone. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the courtroom doors, his body now fully alert, muscles coiled with barely contained tension. Shadow, Mitchell whispered. But the dog didn't respond to his name, another red flag. In all their years together, Shadow had never ignored a direct address from his handler. Something was very wrong. Judge Martinez noticed the change in both dog and handler. Master Sergeant, is everything all right? Before Mitchell could respond, Shadow's growl deepened, his teeth slightly bared. The sound sent a chill through the courtroom. This wasn't the behavior of a trained military dog acting out. This was a warrior sensing danger, trying to warn those around him just as he had done countless times in combat. The bond between Mitchell and Shadow, laid bare through testimony moments ago, was about to be tested in a way neither the court nor the military could have anticipated. Whatever Shadow had detected, Mitchell knew with bone-deep certainty that their story wasn't ending here. It was about to take a turn that would prove, once and for all, that some partnerships transcend any human institution's attempt to sever them. The tension in Courtroom 7A shifted palpably as Shadow's growl resonated through the space. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison paused mid-stride, his objection forgotten, as he watched the Belgian Malinois' behavior with growing concern. The military handler he'd brought with him, Staff Sergeant Reynolds, straightened in his seat, his expression darkening as he observed Shadow's stance. Your Honor, Harrison recovered, his voice cutting through the unsettled murmurs in the gallery. While Master Sergeant Mitchell's testimony is undoubtedly moving, it actually reinforces the Department of Defense's position. Shadow's exceptional abilities, the very instincts that saved those children and Master Sergeant Mitchell himself, are precisely why he's needed for this upcoming operation. Mitchell's hand tightened on Shadow's leash as the dog's muscles bunched beneath his fingers. He'd felt this same tension countless times before, in dusty alleys and mountain passes where death lurked in the shadows. Shadow wasn't just being protective. He was tracking something specific, something that set off every warning bell in Mitchell's combat-hardened instincts. Sarah Chen rose smoothly to counter Harrison's argument. Your Honor, the DOD's position contradicts its own precedent. In 2019, 3 military working dogs were permanently released to their handlers after showing signs of operational stress. The bond between handler and dog was deemed crucial to both parties' well-being. Shadow and Master Sergeant Mitchell have been through severe trauma together. Separating them now could be psychologically devastating to both. Judge Martinez nodded, thoughtfully, but her attention was divided between the legal arguments and Shadow's increasingly alert behavior. The dog's ears were fully erect now, his head turning slightly as if tracking movement beyond the courtroom's heavy doors. Mitchell noticed the judge's gaze and recognized the question in her eyes. Was this normal behavior for a highly trained military dog? Staff Sergeant Reynolds finally spoke up from his position in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may. At the judge's nod he stood, his pristine uniform a stark contrast to Mitchell's battle-worn decorations. As the DOD's senior canine trainer, I can assert that this type of behavior is precisely why Shadow needs to return to active duty. He's displaying hypervigilance, a sign that he's still operating at peak tactical awareness. In the right hands, with proper reconditioning. Shadow's growl cut through Reynolds' words, deeper this time, causing several spectators to shift uneasily in their seats. Mitchell felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He'd heard that specific growl before, in Kandahar, moments before Shadow had detected a suicide bomber approaching their checkpoint. Shadow, easy, Mitchell murmured, but his voice held an edge of tension that those who knew him could detect. Sarah Chen glanced at her client, noting how his posture had shifted subtly into what she recognized as a combat-ready stance, despite his wheelchair. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison pressed his advantage in the momentary silence. Furthermore, Your Honor, Shadow's current behavior demonstrates our concerns. Military working dogs require strict discipline and continuous training. With all due respect to Master Sergeant Mitchell's service and sacrifice, his current condition makes it impossible for him to maintain Shadow's operational readiness. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. A ripple of angry mutters ran through the veterans in the gallery. Mitchell's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Shadow suddenly stood, his body rigid with alertness. The dog's focus remained. Locked on the courtroom doors, his previous growl transforming into a low, continuous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her practiced judicial neutrality giving way to genuine concern. Master, Sergeant Mitchell, please control your dog. Ma'am, Mitchell's voice was tight with controlled urgency. Shadow is controlled, but something's wrong. This isn't anxiety or aggression. This is a tactical alert. I've seen it too many times to mistake it. Sarah Chen quickly picked up on her client's tone. Your Honor, given Master Sergeant Mitchell's extensive experience with Shadow in combat situations, perhaps we should... She was cut off by a sharp bark from Shadow. Not the disciplinary bark of a military dog asserting authority, but the urgent, commanding sound that Mitchell had learned meant imminent threat. The dog's muscles were coiled, tight now, his teeth fully bared, as he stared at the courtroom doors with unflinching intensity. The bailiff's hand moved to his weapon, but Mitchell quickly raised his voice. Don't! He's not being aggressive. He's trying to warn us. Shadow was trained to detect explosives, weapons, and threats of any kind. Something or someone out there has triggered his combat instincts. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison scoffed, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. This is exactly the kind of unstable behavior we're concerned about. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, please approach and take control of the animal. Reynolds stood, reaching for the spare leash at his belt, but Shadow's reaction was immediate and shocking. The dog moved to place himself between Mitchell and Reynolds, his warning growl now unmistakably protective. This wasn't just a military working dog following training. This was a warrior protecting his brother in arms. The gallery erupted in whispers as Judge Martinez banged her gavel. Order! Master Sergeant Mitchell, I need you to explain exactly what's happening with Shadow right now, or I will have no choice but to... Her words were cut short by a sound that made Mitchell's blood run cold, the distinct metallic click of a door latch being carefully, quietly manipulated. Shadow's barking escalated to full alert, the sound bouncing off the courtroom's high ceiling as the heavy doors began to move. The bond between handler and dog, just moments ago, the subject of legal debate, was about to prove its worth in a way that would leave no room for argument. Whatever was coming through those doors, Shadow had detected it long before anyone else, and now, in this courtroom far from any battlefield, his warning would prove that some partnerships were forged by forces far stronger than military regulations. Time seemed to slow in courtroom 7A as the heavy oak doors inched open. Shadow's barking ceased abruptly, replaced by a low, steady growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The sudden silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft shuffling of nervous spectators and the barely audible creak of the door hinges. Mitchell's mind raced through years of combat experience, analyzing Shadow's behavior with the precision of a soldier who had trusted this dog with his life countless times. The Belgian Malinois' ears were fully erect, his head low, and his muscles coiled tight, a posture Mitchell had seen only in the most dangerous situations. They'd faced together. Sarah Chen had unconsciously moved closer to her client, her legal papers forgotten on the defense table. She'd spent weeks preparing arguments about the psychological bond between handler and dog, citing cases and regulations. But watching Shadow now, seeing the seamless communication between him and Mitchell, made all those carefully crafted legal points seem suddenly inadequate. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison remained standing, his earlier confidence wavering as he watched Shadow's behavior with growing concern. As a career military officer, he knew the capabilities of these dogs. He'd seen them in action, trusted them with his own life during deployments. The DoD's position had seemed so clear in the sterile environment of his office at the Pentagon, but here, watching Shadow's focused intensity, doubt began to creep in. Judge Martinez's hand rested on her gavel, but she didn't bring it down. 20 years on the bench had taught her to read rooms, to sense when something was truly wrong. The tension radiating from both Shadow and Mitchell was unlike anything she'd encountered in her courtroom before. This wasn't the anxiety of a court proceeding. This was the taut anticipation of combat. Staff Sergeant Reynolds had frozen mid-step, the spare leash still in his hand. His expertise with military working dogs told him that Shadow's behavior wasn't aggression or stress. It was pure, tactical focus. The dog was operating exactly as he'd been trained, identifying and responding to a potential threat with disciplined precision. Mitchell's hand moved slowly to Shadow's back, feeling the familiar ripple of muscle beneath the tactical vest. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, meant only for his partner. "I know, boy. I trust you, just like always." The words carried the weight of 1,000 shared moments, of split-second decisions that had meant the difference. Between life and death, the gallery had fallen completely silent, the earlier murmurs of the spectators replaced by held breath and racing hearts. The veterans in attendance recognized the tension in the air. It was the same heaviness they'd felt in moments before ambushes, before IEDs, before everything changed in the blink of an eye. Through the partially open door, the fluorescent lights from the hallway cast long shadows across the courtroom floor. Shadow's eyes tracked something unseen, his head moving with the slow, deliberate motion that Mitchell recognized from their time detecting hidden threats in abandoned buildings and narrow alleyways. Sarah Chen's legal mind was already racing ahead, considering the implications of what was unfolding. If Shadow's behavior proved justified, if there really was a threat, it would do more than just validate Mitchell's argument for keeping him. It would challenge the entire framework of how military working dogs were classified under the law. The bailiff's hand remained on his weapon, but he looked to Judge Martinez for guidance. The usual protocols for courtroom disruption seemed woefully inadequate for whatever was unfolding. Martinez met his gaze and gave a slight shake of her head, a silent command to wait, to trust the instincts of the decorated soldier and his combat-proven companion. Mitchell's wheelchair creaked softly as he leaned forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a master sergeant as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, Shadow's never wrong. Not about this. Whatever's coming through that door, whatever he's sensing, it's real. I've staked my life on his instincts more times than I can count, and he's never failed me." The words seemed to hang in the air, settling over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's earlier arguments about military property and operational needs suddenly seemed hollow in the face of this visceral demonstration of the bond between handler and dog. This wasn't about regulations or chain of command. This was about something far more fundamental. Shadow's muscles bunched tighter under Mitchell's hand, and the dog's growl deepened to a frequency that seemed to resonate with something primitive in everyone present. It was the sound of an ancient partnership between human and canine, a warning call that preceded civilization itself. Judge Martinez leaned forward slightly, her voice barely audible but carrying the full weight of her authority. "Master Sergeant, Mitchell, what exactly is your dog trying to tell us?" Before Mitchell could respond, Shadow's head snapped sharply toward a specific point beyond the doors, his entire body going rigid. In that moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, suspended in the space between warning and revelation. Whatever was about to unfold would not just decide Shadow's fate. It would challenge everything the court thought it knew about the relationship between a soldier and his dog. The courtroom doors swung open wider, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. The afternoon sun had disappeared behind gathering storm clouds, casting the hallway in an unsettling twilight. Shadow's growl maintained its deep, warning tone as a court officer appeared in the doorway, his uniform neat and proper, his movements measured and professional. "Just a routine check, Your Honor," the officer announced, but something in his tone made Mitchell's combat instincts flare. Shadow's reaction intensified, his growl deepening as his eyes remained fixed not on the officer, but on something beyond. Him in the shadows of the hallway. Mitchell's hand tightened on Shadow's tactical vest, feeling the subtle vibrations of the dog's continued growl. During their years in combat, he'd learned to read these signals like a language all their own. This wasn't Shadow's alert for explosives. That had a different pitch, a different urgency. This was something else, something that reminded Mitchell of the time they'd uncovered a hidden weapons cache in a seemingly abandoned compound. "Your Honor," Mitchell spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command, "that officer isn't one of your regular courtroom staff, is he?" Judge Martinez's eyes narrowed as she studied the man in the doorway. "No," she replied slowly. "He's not." The revelation sent a ripple of unease through the gallery. The court officer's hand moved slightly, adjusting his jacket in a motion that might have seemed innocent to anyone else. But Shadow's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His growl transformed into a series of sharp, tactical barks, the same signal he'd used countless times to alert Mitchell to concealed weapons. "Lieutenant." Colonel Harrison stood abruptly, his military training overriding his role as prosecutor. "Sir," he called out to the officer, "I need to see your credentials right now." The officer's pleasant expression didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. "Of course, sir. Just let me reach for my badge." His hand moved toward his jacket. Again, but Shadow's barking increased in intensity, the sound bouncing off the wooden walls with almost painful force. "Don't move!" Mitchell's command cut through the air with battlefield authority. Shadow's trained to detect weapons, explosives, and threat behaviors. Whatever you're reaching for, he knows it's not a badge. The gallery erupted in whispers as several veterans in attendance shifted forward in their seats, their own combat instincts awakening. Sarah Chen had already begun quietly motioning for the civilian spectators nearest her to move toward the side exits, her movements careful and deliberate to avoid triggering any sudden reactions. Judge Martinez's hand moved slowly beneath her bench, likely reaching for the panic button. But Mitchell gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Any sudden moves now could escalate the situation beyond control. Shadow maintained his alert, his body practically vibrating with controlled energy as he kept his focus on the officer. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, still holding the spare leash, spoke up from his position near the gallery. "That's a level 3. Alert posture," he confirmed, his expertise with military working dogs adding weight to Mitchell's concerns. "It's specific to immediate threat detection. These dogs don't give false positives at this level of intensity." The court officer's smile remained fixed, but beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead. "There seems to be some misunderstanding," he said smoothly, his hand still hovering near his jacket. "I'm simply here to deliver an urgent message to the judge." "Then deliver it from where you stand," Mitchell countered, his years of tactical experience evident in his tone. Shadow's growl deepened again, and Mitchell felt the subtle shift in the dog's muscles that preceded action. Whatever was hidden beneath that jacket, Shadow was preparing to respond to it. The tension in the courtroom had reached a breaking point. The bailiff had drawn his weapon but kept it lowered, aware that any sudden movement could trigger a cascade of reactions. Judge Martinez sat perfectly still, her years of judicial composure being tested against the raw instincts of a military working dog she'd been about to rule against just minutes ago. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had unconsciously shifted his position, placing himself between the officer and the civilian spectators. His earlier arguments about Shadow being merely government property seemed to have evaporated in the face of this demonstration of the dog's vital capabilities. A low rumble of thunder rolled outside, and the courthouse's old windows rattled slightly in their frames. The sound seemed to break something in the officer's carefully maintained facade. His smile flickered, and his hand moved a fraction faster toward his jacket. Shadow's response was instantaneous, a sharp, commanding bark that Mitchell recognized as the dog's final warning before engagement. The sound froze everyone in place, creating a tableau of suspended motion. The officer with his hand mid-reach, the bailiff adjusting his grip on his weapon, Judge Martinez half risen from her bench, and the spectators caught between fight and flight. In that crystallized moment, Mitchell's voice cut through the tension with cold clarity. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, you should know something. That bark wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Shadow's given you every chance to stand down, just like he was trained to do. His next move won't be a warning." The officer's eyes darted between Mitchell's unflinching gaze and Shadow's combat-ready stance, calculating his odds. But Mitchell knew what the man would see in Shadow, the same unwavering focus that had saved countless lives in combat, the same lethal capability that had earned him multiple combat citations. This wasn't just a military working dog anymore. This was a warrior protecting his unit, and everyone in that courtroom had just become part of that unit. The tension shattered like glass as 3 more figures appeared in the hallway behind the false officer. They moved with military precision, their dark clothing and tactical gear a stark contrast to the courthouse's formal atmosphere. Shadow's barking shifted to a higher pitch, the same alert pattern he'd used in Afghanistan when multiple threats converged at once. "Everyone down!" Mitchell's command carried the weight of battlefield authority. The veterans in the gallery responded instantly, pulling civilians to the floor as Shadow maintained his protective stance. The false officer's hand finally completed its motion, drawing not a badge, but a matte black pistol with a suppressor already attached. The courthouse's security system had been compromised. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's face drained of color as he recognized the implications. "This isn't random," he said, his voice tight. "They knew exactly when and where this hearing would be." The lead figure stepped forward, his movements controlled and confident. Unlike his companions, he wore no tactical gear, just an expensive suit that seemed at odds with the situation. His smile was cold, professional, as he surveyed the courtroom. "Master Sergeant Mitchell," he said, his accent slight but distinct, "your reputation with that dog has caused quite a bit of interest in certain circles." Sarah Chen had positioned herself behind Mitchell's wheelchair, her legal training warring with the surreal turn of events. "Whatever you're planning," she started, but the man cut her off with a casual wave. "What we're planning, Ms. Chen, is already in motion. Did you really think this was about military bureaucracy, about who gets custody of a dog?" His laugh was hollow, empty of any real amusement. Shadow's abilities are extraordinary, even by military working dog standards. His success rate in detecting improvised explosives is unprecedented. His ability to anticipate threats before they materialize, well, that's caught the attention of people willing to pay handsomely for such talents. Mitchell's mind raced as pieces fell into place. The rushed hearing, the unusual pressure from the Department of Defense, the insistence that Shadow was needed for an immediate classified operation. "There is no classified mission, is there?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The man's smile widened fractionally. "Oh, there is, just not one sanctioned by your government." He gestured to his men, who began to spread out along the courtroom's perimeter. "Shadow's abilities make him uniquely valuable to certain private military contractors who operate in areas where conventional rules of engagement don't apply." Shadow's growl deepened as one of the men moved closer, but he maintained his position, protecting Mitchell. The bond between them, so recently debated as a legal issue, had transformed into a tactical advantage. They'd faced combat situations together countless times, reading each other's signals with a synchronization that no training manual could teach. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his military bearing absolute despite the situation. "You won't make it out of this building. Every exit will be locked down the moment shots are fired." The man in the suit seemed almost amused. "Colonel, do you really think we haven't planned for that? The courthouse's security systems are under our control. The cameras are on a loop, the panic buttons are disabled. And as for the exits..." He pulled a small device from his pocket, pressing a button that caused distant thuds to echo through the building. "All secondary exits are now magnetically sealed. We control who leaves this room and when." A crack of thunder punctuated his words, and rain began to lash against the courthouse windows. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon had finally broken, adding a dramatic backdrop to the unfolding crisis. Mitchell felt Shadow's muscles bunch beneath his hand, recognizing the subtle shift that meant the dog was preparing for action. "You're forgetting something," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a soldier who had faced death before. "Shadow isn't just trained to detect threats, he's trained to neutralize them." The man's smile never wavered. "We're counting on it, Sergeant. His aggressive capabilities are part of what makes him so valuable. Once we've dealt with any resistance here, he'll be reconditioned. His loyalty to you will be redirected." Those words triggered something in Shadow. The dog's growl transformed into a sound Mitchell had heard only twice before, a primal warning that preceded immediate action. The man must have recognized the change too, because his hand moved toward his own weapon. "Last chance," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Stand down, or find out why Shadow's combat record includes more confirmed takedowns than any other military working dog in service." The man's response was to draw his weapon, but Shadow was already moving. What happened next would become courthouse legend, a demonstration of why the bond between a handler and his dog transcended simple training. It wasn't just about commands and responses anymore. It was about two warriors moving as one, protecting not just each other but everyone in that courtroom. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the scene in strobing flashes as Shadow prepared to prove that some partnerships couldn't be broken by force, couldn't be bought with money, and couldn't be redirected by any amount of reconditioning. The real battle for Shadow's future was about to begin, and it would be fought not in legal arguments, but in the language of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his dog. Lightning flashed again, casting harsh shadows across the courtroom as Shadow launched into action. The Belgian Malinois moved with explosive force, years of tactical training evident in every motion. The man in the suit barely had time to level his weapon before Shadow's powerful form crashed into him, sending the gun skittering across the polished floor. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The false officer by the door raised his weapon, but Mitchell's voice cut through the pandemonium with a command that Shadow had heard countless times in combat. "Switch target." Without hesitation, Shadow released his first opponent and pivoted toward the new threat, his movements fluid and precise. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison seized the moment to tackle the suited man, his military training overriding his usual administrative role. "Get the civilians out," he shouted as he grappled with the man, who was already reaching for a backup weapon hidden in his ankle holster. Sarah Chen began urgently shepherding spectators toward the side door, but one of the tactical-clad figures moved to intercept them. Mitchell watched in horror as the man raised his weapon toward the crowd, but before he could fire, a blur of motion caught everyone's attention. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, the DoD's own canine trainer, had launched himself over the gallery barrier. His expertise with military working dogs hadn't been limited to training. He'd served in combat too. His shoulder caught the gunman's midsection, sending them both crashing into the wooden benches. Shadow, meanwhile, had the false officer pinned, the man's weapon arm locked in powerful jaws. The dog's training ensured he applied exactly enough pressure to immobilize without causing permanent damage, unless ordered otherwise. The man's face contorted in pain as he tried to break free, but Shadow's grip was unshakable. "Mitchell!" Sarah Chen's voice cut through the chaos. She'd managed to get the door open, but the magnetic lock was slowly re-engaging. "We need to move now!" Thunder crashed outside as Mitchell wheeled himself toward the suited man, who was still wrestling with Harrison. "Shadow, hold!" The command rang with authority, freezing everyone in place. The Belgian Malinois maintained his grip on the false officer, but turned his attention to his handler. "You're right about one thing," Mitchell addressed the suited man, who had frozen at the command, recognizing the absolute control Mitchell had over Shadow. "He is exceptional, but not because of his detection rates or his combat skills. It's because he can't be bought, can't be corrupted. His loyalty isn't programmed, it's earned." The suited man's cold composure finally cracked. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he snarled. "We're just the first. Shadow's abilities are worth millions to the right buyers. Private security firms, foreign militaries, intelligence agencies. They'll keep coming. You can't. Protect him forever." A new sound cut through the rain-soaked air, police sirens in the distance. Someone in the building must have gotten a call out. The suited man's eyes darted to his remaining men, calculating odds that were rapidly turning against him. "Shadow, escort!" Mitchell commanded. The Belgian Malinois released the false officer, but maintained a threatening stance, herding him toward the others with practiced precision. The dog moved with fluid grace, positioning himself to watch all threats simultaneously, just as he'd done countless times on patrol in Afghanistan. Judge Martinez had finally emerged from behind her bench, her judicial demeanor shaken, but her voice steady. "Colonel Harrison, are you armed?" Harrison nodded grimly, producing a concealed carry weapon. "Federal judges' chambers are within my jurisdiction, Your Honor." He trained the weapon on the suited man, while Reynolds, having subdued his opponent, used his own belt to secure the man's hands. The sirens were getting closer, but Mitchell noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The suited man's expression had shifted from frustration to a cold smile. "You think this is over?" he laughed, the sound hollow in the storm-darkened room. "Check your phones. Every major news outlet in Boston just received evidence of Shadow, failing his last 3 readiness evaluations, documents showing aggressive incidents, medical reports questioning his stability." Sarah Chen's face paled as she pulled out her phone. "He's right. It's already trending on social media." "All falsified, of course," the man continued, his composure returning. "But by the time the truth comes out, the narrative will be set. A dangerous military dog, a liability to public safety. The courts will have no choice but to order him remanded to military custody." And then his smile widened. "Well, things get lost in transfer all the time." Mitchell felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just about stealing Shadow anymore. It was about destroying his reputation, manipulating the system itself. The legal battle they'd walked into this morning had just transformed into something far more complex. Shadow moved closer to Mitchell, his body still alert but seeking the familiar connection that had gotten them through countless dangerous situations. The dog's ears twitched at the growing sound of sirens, but his focus remained absolute, protecting not just his handler now, but everyone in that courtroom. The rain continued to lash against the windows as lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes, Harrison holding his weapon steady, Reynolds securing the last of the attackers, Sarah Chen frantically working her phone to counter the spreading disinformation, and Judge Martinez watching it all with an expression that said this was far from over. But at the center of it all stood Shadow and Mitchell, their bond no longer just a legal issue to be decided, but a living shield against forces that would exploit Shadow's abilities for their own ends. The battle for Shadow's future had just expanded far beyond the courtroom, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. The courthouse's ancient heating system groaned as another crack of thunder shook the windows. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound, but his focus remained unbroken, his body still positioned between Mitchell and the restrained attackers. The sirens were closer now, their wail cutting through the storm, but the suited man's confident smirk hadn't wavered. "You should check your inbox, Judge Martinez," he called out, his voice carrying an unsettling note of triumph despite his circumstances. "I believe you'll find an urgent email from the Department of Defense regarding Shadow's service record." Martinez retrieved her phone, her expression darkening as she scrolled through the message. "This is impossible," she muttered. "There are incident reports here dating back months. Behavioral assessments, psychiatric evaluations." "All fabricated," Mitchell cut in, his voice sharp with barely contained anger. "Shadow's real records are stored in a secure military database. These are forgeries." The suited man's smile widened. "Are you sure about that, Sergeant? The military's own systems can be persuaded to update their records, especially when the right passwords are required. Check the digital signatures. Everything is authenticated, time-stamped, and officially logged." Sarah Chen was already on her phone, her legal mind racing ahead to the implications. "They've thought this through," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Even if we prove these records are falsified, the immediate pressure from the media and public safety concerns would force the court to temporarily remand Shadow to military custody, pending investigation. And once he's in the system," Harrison added grimly, "they can make him disappear." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in harsh white light. The restrained attackers, Harrison with his weapons still trained on the suited man, Reynolds, securing the last zip ties, and Shadow, standing guard with the same unwavering focus he'd shown in countless combat situations. But something was wrong. Mitchell noticed it first, a subtle change in Shadow's posture, a slight tilt of his head. The dog's ears were moving in a pattern Mitchell recognized from their time in Afghanistan, tracking multiple threats simultaneously. "Something's coming," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded troops in combat. Shadows picking up movement outside the courtroom. The suited man's smile took on a predatory edge. "Did you really think we came without backup? Everything that's happened in this room was just phase 1. The real operation is about to begin." As if on cue, the courthouse's power grid failed. The overhead lights died with a soft hum, plunging the room into storm-darkened shadows broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. Emergency lights sputtered to life, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Shadow's growl deepened as heavy footsteps echoed from multiple directions in the hallway. The dog's muscles bunched beneath his tactical vest, ready for action. Mitchell recognized the change in his partner's breathing. Shadow was shifting from defense to combat mode, preparing for a serious threat. "Your Honor," Mitchell's voice was low but carried clearly, "whatever happens next, stay behind me and Shadow. The same goes for any civilians still in the room." He turned to Harrison and Reynolds. "Colonel Sergeant, I assume you remember your close-quarters combat training?" Both men nodded grimly, taking up defensive positions near the judge's bench. Sarah Chen had positioned herself near the remaining civilians, her phone now forgotten as she focused on the immediate threat. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the distinct sound of tactical gear shifting, professional operators moving. With purpose, Shadow's ears tracked their movement, his head turning slightly as he mapped their positions through sound alone. "Last chance, Sergeant," the suited man called out, still somehow maintaining his composure. "Surrender Shadow now, and everyone walks out of here. Resist and things get very messy. My employers are not known for their patience." Mitchell's response was cold and immediate. "Shadow. Guard position Alpha." The Belgian Malinois moved instantly, taking up a strategic position that covered both the main entrance and the side door. It was a combat formation they'd used countless times, maximizing Shadow's ability to respond to threats from multiple directions. "You're forgetting something," Mitchell continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had faced death, and worse in combat. "Shadow and I didn't just serve together. We specialized in impossible situations, outnumbered, outgunned, backed into corners just like this one. Do you know our record for those situations?" The suited man's smile faltered slightly as Shadow let out a low, warning growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "We never lost," Mitchell finished, just as the emergency lights caught the gleam of Shadow's teeth. "Not once. Not when it mattered. And right now, this matters more than anything." The footsteps outside had stopped. In the storm-broken silence, the sound of multiple weapons being readied echoed through the hallway. Shadow's muscles coiled tighter, his training and instincts merging into lethal readiness. Judge Martinez spoke up, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority despite the situation. "Whatever you're planning, you should know that I just authorized a full recording of these proceedings on my private server. Everything that's happened in this room, everything you've said, it's already been uploaded." The suited man's composure cracked for the first time, real anger flashing across his face. "Upload all you want. Dead judges can't testify, and servers can be erased." That threat hung in the air for a moment before Shadow's posture changed again. The dog's growl shifted to a higher pitch, a sound Mitchell had heard only twice before. In combat, it meant imminent threat, multiple hostiles, and no way out except through. Thunder crashed outside as Shadow prepared for what was coming. The bond between handler and dog, so recently debated in legal terms, was about to be demonstrated in the language they knew best, the grammar of survival, written in loyalty. And trust, spelled out in actions that would leave no doubt about why some partnerships transcended simple ownership. The storm raged on outside as everyone in the courtroom held their breath, waiting for whatever came next. But Mitchell and Shadow were ready, their years of combat experience and unwavering trust about to be tested one more time. The courtroom doors burst open simultaneously, flooding the storm-darkened room with tactical flashlight beams. Shadows. Warning growl transformed into sharp, commanding barks as multiple figures in black tactical gear moved in with military precision. But something about their movement made Mitchell pause. There was a familiarity to their formation. "Stand down, Shadow," a deep voice commanded from the hallway. "Authorization code Echo 7 Delta 9. Shadow's ears perked up, but he didn't relax his stance. The dog looked to Mitchell, their years of partnership evident in that single moment of silent communication. Mitchell recognized what was happening even before the tactical team's leader stepped into view. "Captain Marcus Torres," Mitchell breathed, recognizing his former commanding officer from their last deployment. "Special Operations Command." The suited man's composure finally shattered completely. "This is impossible," he snarled. "Our intelligence confirmed SOCOM wasn't involved." Torres's smile was cold as Arctic steel as he stepped fully into the red-tinted emergency lighting. "That's because this operation wasn't initiated by SOCOM." He nodded to his team, who quickly moved to secure the detained attackers. "We're here because of Shadow." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene as Torres approached Mitchell and Shadow. The dog's posture relaxed slightly, recognizing a familiar scent from countless missions, but he maintained his protective position beside Mitchell. The moment these mercenaries started probing Shadow's records, they triggered a silent alert, Torres explained, his voice carrying easily through the tension-filled room. "Did you really think the military would leave its most successful combat dog team unprotected after retirement?" Sarah Chen stepped forward, legal pad in hand despite the chaos. "You've been monitoring them." Torres nodded. Shadow and Mitchell's missions in Afghanistan weren't just combat operations. They were part of a classified program studying exceptional handler-dog partnerships. Their success rate wasn't just impressive, it was unprecedented. The bond they formed went beyond training, beyond what we thought possible. The suited man tried to maintain his arrogant demeanor, but fear had crept into his eyes. "You're bluffing. Our intelligence sources were fed exactly what we wanted them to see." Torres cut him off. "Those falsified records you planted, we let you do it. The compromised security systems, we monitored every keystroke. This entire operation was a trap designed to draw out the organization that's been targeting retired military working dogs across 3 continents." Judge Martinez had returned to her bench, her judicial authority reasserting itself as she processed this new information. "Captain Torres, are you telling me this hearing itself was part of a military operation?" "Not exactly, Your Honor," Torres replied. "The custody hearing was legitimate, but we knew these mercenaries wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity. Shadow's abilities are unique, even among elite military working dogs. His combat record tells only half the story." Mitchell wheeled himself closer to Shadow, his hand finding the dog's fur in a gesture of reassurance. The classified program, it was about more than just combat effectiveness, wasn't it? Torres's expression softened slightly. Shadow's ability to anticipate threats, to sense danger before it materialized. It went beyond training, beyond even natural canine instincts. The bond you two formed created something we still don't fully understand. That's why they wanted him so badly. And that's why we couldn't let them have him. The storm outside was beginning to fade, the thunder now distant rumbles. Shadow's ears tracked the sound of more footsteps in the hallway, regular law enforcement arriving to secure the scene. The dog's posture remained alert, but calm, Sensing the shift in the situation, the Department of Defense's position in this hearing, Harrison spoke up, still holding his weapon trained on the suited man. Was it real or part of the operation? The DoD's concerns were genuine, Torres confirmed, but not for the reasons stated in court. We needed Shadow to appear vulnerable, detachable from Mitchell. The threat of separation had to seem real enough to draw out our targets. Sarah Chen was rapidly taking notes, her legal mind already processing the implications. So, the precedent this case could have set for military working dogs will still be set, Torres interrupted, but not based on the argument that these dogs are mere equipment. Rather, on the recognition that the bonds they form with their handlers are a crucial component of national security. He turned to the Ike judge. Your Honor, I have authorization to submit classified evidence demonstrating why Shadow and Mitchell's partnership needs to remain intact. The suited man made one last attempt to regain control. You have no jurisdiction here. This is a civilian court. Actually, Judge Martinez cut in, her voice sharp with authority. Given the national security implications Captain Torres has just revealed, this case now falls under federal jurisdiction. And I believe we've seen more than enough evidence today to make a ruling on Shadow's custody. Mitchell felt Shadow lean slightly against his wheelchair, not seeking comfort, but offering it. Their partnership had been tested in combat countless times, but this battle in a Boston courtroom had proven something even more fundamental. Their bond wasn't just about military effectiveness or even loyalty. It was about two warriors who had found in each other something that transcended ordinary definitions of partnership. The tactical team was efficiently processing the mercenaries, reading them their rights despite their status as enemy combatants. Torres watched the procedure with satisfaction before turning back to Mitchell and Shadow. You know, he said quietly, in all the years we've studied exceptional handler-dog partnerships, we've never seen anything quite like you two. What you have goes beyond training, beyond military necessity. It's something else entirely. Mitchell nodded, his hand still resting on Shadow's fur. The dog's eyes remained alert, scanning the room out of habit, protecting his handler even in this moment of relative safety. Some bonds, Mitchell realized, couldn't be broken by legal arguments or military regulations. Some partnerships were forged in fire, tested in combat, and proven in moments like this, when loyalty and trust meant the difference between life and death. The relative calm that had settled over the courtroom was shattered by Shadow's sudden return to alert status. The dog's ears snapped forward, his body tensing as he turned toward the gallery's far corner. Mitchell recognized the change immediately. This wasn't Shadow's normal threat response. This was something different, something urgent. Torres! Mitchell's voice cut through the procedural noise of the arrests. Shadow's got something! The Special Operations team responded instantly, their weapons tracking to Shadow's line of sight. The suited man, still in custody, began to laugh, a cold, knowing sound that sent chills through the room. You didn't think we'd risk everything on a single plan, did you? He taunted. Check the ventilation system, now! Shadow's barking took on a specific pattern that Mitchell hadn't heard since their last deployment, the alert for chemical threats. Torres recognized it too, his face hardening as he keyed his radio. All units, we have a possible CBRN threat. Lock down the ventilation system immediately. The courthouse's ancient ductwork rattled ominously, and a faint hissing sound became audible over the diminishing storm outside. Shadow's barking intensified, becoming more urgent with each passing. Second, everyone out, Torres commanded, but Mitchell raised his hand. Wait! He wheeled closer to Shadow, reading the dog's body language. He's not telling us to evacuate. He's indicating a specific location. Mitchell knew every nuance of Shadow's alerts, every subtle variation in his partner's behavior. The threat's not in the vents. It's coming from somewhere else. Judge Martinez had risen from her bench, her judicial composure warring with the very real danger. Captain Torres, what are we dealing with? Based on Shadow's alert pattern, Torres replied, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Some kind of chemical agent. But Mitchell's right. Shadow's behavior suggests a point source, not system-wide dispersal. The suited man's laughter had taken on an edge of madness. "Tick-tock," he taunted. "The longer you take to find it, the more it builds up. And once it reaches critical concentration, Shadow suddenly moved with purpose, heading straight for an ornate wooden panel near the judge's chambers. The dog's nose worked the air methodically, his training allowing him to pinpoint the threat through layers of old wood and plaster. "There," Mitchell pointed. "That section of wall wasn't in the original courthouse blueprints. It was added during renovations 3 years ago." His military intelligence training kicked in, connecting dots that had seemed unrelated. "The same time your organization started targeting military working dogs." Torres's team moved swiftly. Specialized detection, equipment confirming what Shadow had already found. Behind the panel was a sophisticated device, its digital display counting down with ominous precision. "Chemical dispersal unit," Torres announced grimly. "Military grade. Set to release some kind of nerve agent." He studied the device's configuration. "This is Russian technology, modified with Chinese components. Your employers have interesting connections." The suited man's smile never wavered. "You have 2 choices, Captain. Either you let us walk out of here with the dog, or in exactly 3 minutes, everyone in this room experiences exactly why our organization values chemical weapons experts so highly." Shadow's growl deepened as he maintained his position by the device, but his eyes never left his handler. Mitchell felt the weight of every life in the room pressing down on him, but in Shadow's steady gaze he found the clarity he needed. "Shadow," Mitchell commanded, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Diagnostics." Without hesitation, Shadow began a precise sequence of barks and movements, a pattern that Torres recognized from the classified program's files. The dog wasn't just alerting to the threat. He was communicating specific details about the device's construction. "My God," Torres breathed. "He's actually reading the chemical composition, the dispersal pattern, everything we'd need to disarm it." The suited man's composure finally cracked completely. "That's impossible. No dog can—" "No ordinary dog," Mitchell corrected, his voice hard with pride and purpose. "Shadow was part of the program for a reason. His ability to process and communicate complex threat data went beyond anything we'd seen before. That's why you really wanted him, isn't it? Not just for his detection skills, but for what he represents, the next evolution in military working dog capabilities." Torres's team worked rapidly, using Shadow's continued signals to guide their disarmament procedures. Each bark, each subtle change in the dog's posture, conveyed crucial information about the device's fail-safes and trigger mechanisms. Judge Martinez watched in amazement as Shadow effectively walked the tactical team through the disarmament process. "I think," she said slowly, "we can safely say this demonstration renders any question of Shadow's custody rather moot." The device's countdown froze, with 27 seconds remaining. Torres's explosives expert carefully removed the chemical payload, securing it in a specialized container. "Device neutralized," he reported, "thanks to our 4-legged EOD tech here." Shadow finally relaxed his alert posture, returning to Mitchell's side. The bond between them, so recently discussed in terms of legal precedent and military regulations, had just demonstrated its true value, not just in combat effectiveness, but in the intuitive understanding that allowed them to protect others. The suited man slumped in defeat as federal agents arrived to take custody of him and his team. The charges now would go far beyond attempted theft of military property. This had become a matter of international terrorism, chemical weapons, and attempted mass murder. Torres approached Mitchell and Shadow, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said quietly, "I've studied every handler dog team in the program. Seen capabilities that push the boundaries of what we thought possible. But what you two just did," he shook his head in amazement. "That wasn't just training or even exceptional ability. That was something else entirely." Mitchell reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears, feeling the familiar warmth of his partner's presence. "It's trust," he said simply. "Pure and absolute. Everything else, the training, the missions, the abilities, it all comes down to that." Shadow leaned into Mitchell's touch, his eyes still scanning the room out of habit, still protecting his handler even in this moment of victory. Some partnerships, Mitchell realized, couldn't be measured by military metrics or legal standards. They could only be understood in moments like this, when trust became the difference between life and death, and loyalty proved stronger than any force that tried to break it. The courthouse buzzed with activity as federal agents processed the scene, their evidence markers dotting the courtroom like bright yellow stars against the dark wood. The storm outside had finally passed, allowing late afternoon sunlight to stream through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes disturbed by the recent chaos. Judge Martinez had relocated to her chambers, where she was coordinating with federal authorities and drafting an emergency order regarding Shadow's custody. The courtroom itself had become a nexus of activity, with various agencies documenting what would undoubtedly become a landmark case in military working dog legislation. Mitchell sat quietly with Shadow at his side, watching as Torres's team methodically dismantled the chemical device for evidence. The Belgian Malinois remained alert but relaxed, occasionally pressing closer to Mitchell's wheelchair when someone passed too near. Their bond, so recently challenged, had emerged stronger than ever. Sarah. Jen approached them, her legal pad now filled with rapid notes and amendments. "The judge is preparing her ruling," she said, her voice carrying a note of triumph. "But given what just happened, I think it's safe to say we've won more than just a custody case." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been conferring with federal prosecutors, joined their small group. His earlier opposition to Mitchell keeping Shadow seemed like a lifetime ago. "The DOD is already drafting new protocols for retired military working dogs," he announced. "Your case is going to change everything, Mitchell. The bond between handlers and their dogs will now be considered a matter of national security." Mitchell's hand found Shadow's fur, feeling the familiar warmth that had guided him through countless dangerous situations. "It should never have been in question," he said quietly. "These dogs aren't just equipment. They're not just assets. They're partners in every sense of the word." A commotion near the courtroom doors drew their attention. The suited man was being led out in chains, surrounded by federal agents. He stopped briefly, looking back at Mitchell and Shadow with a mixture of defeat and lingering calculation. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he called out. "The program we're developing, it's the future. Dogs like Shadow are just the beginning. We're going to revolutionize military capability." Torres stepped forward, his voice hard with authority. "By stealing decorated war dogs, by threatening federal judges and deploying chemical weapons on U.S. soil, that's not revolution, that's terrorism." The suited man's smile returned, though it held no warmth. "You think this is over? Our organization has resources you can't imagine. Connections that reach into every level of..." Shadow's sudden bark cut him off mid-sentence. The dog hadn't moved from Mitchell's side, but his voice carried the same authority it had in combat. A clear warning that needed no translation. "You still don't get it," Mitchell said, addressing the suited man. "Shadow's abilities, his intelligence, his loyalty, they can't be replicated in a lab or bought with money. What we have was forged in battle, strengthened through trust, and proven in moments like today." The federal agents resumed leading their prisoner away, but Mitchell noticed Shadow's attention had shifted to the gallery. Following his partner's gaze, He spotted several veterans who had stayed behind after the evacuation, wanting to witness the resolution of this unprecedented case. One of them, an older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, approached slowly. "I was a dog handler in '69, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Lost my partner during the evacuation of Saigon. Back then, military dogs were classified as equipment. We had to leave them behind." He looked at Shadow with understanding in his aged eyes. What happened here today? It's justice that's been a long time coming. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, who'd been helping document Shadow's actions for the official report, joined the conversation. "The training program is going to be completely revised," he announced. "We're going to start incorporating what we've learned about handler-dog bonds into the core curriculum. Shadow's capabilities, his connection with you, Mitchell, it's going to become the new standard." Sarah Chen was rapidly adding to her notes. "This is going to affect more than just military cases," she explained. "The precedent we're setting here will impact police K9 units, search and rescue teams, any situation where working dogs form deep bonds with their handlers." Mitchell watched as Shadow's ears tracked each speaker, the dog's intelligence evident in his attentive expressions. This was the same partner who had saved his life countless times, who had just prevented a terrorist attack, and who had never once wavered in his loyalty. The afternoon sun had begun to slant more sharply through the windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. In one beam of light, Mitchell could see specks of dust from the earlier struggle, dancing like golden motes in the warm air. Shadow watched them too, but his body remained positioned protectively near Mitchell's wheelchair. Judge Martinez emerged from her chambers, her robes rustling as she approached their group. Her judicial demeanor had returned, but there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there during the morning's proceedings. "Master Sergeant Mitchell," she began, her voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I believe we've seen more than enough evidence today to render a final ruling. However," she paused, looking at Shadow with newfound respect, "I think it's important that we acknowledge this case has become about much more than simple custody." Mitchell nodded, feeling Shadow press against his leg in a gesture of solidarity that had comforted him through countless difficult moments. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as handler and military working dog, but as partners who had proven their bond was stronger than any force that tried to break. And 1 week later, Courtroom 7A looked markedly different from the battlefield it had become. The wooden panels had been repaired, the benches polished, and all signs of the confrontation had been carefully erased. But for those who had been present that day, the space would forever hold the memory of an extraordinary demonstration of loyalty and courage. Judge Martinez sat at her bench, her chambers now restored to their former dignity. The courtroom was once again filled, but this time with a different energy. Representatives from military and law enforcement agencies across the country sat alongside veterans and media personnel, all gathered for what would become a landmark. Ruling in military working dog legislation. Mitchell and Shadow occupied the same position they had a week ago, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Shadow sat alertly beside Mitchell's wheelchair, his tactical vest adorned with a new medal. The Department of Defense had fast-tracked a commendation for his role in preventing the terrorist attack. The sight of it gleaming against his fur brought a quiet pride to Mitchell's eyes. "Before I deliver my ruling," Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom, "I want to address the broader implications of what we witnessed here last week. This case began as a simple custody hearing, but it has evolved into something far more significant." She paused, looking directly at Mitchell and Shadow. "The events that unfolded in this courtroom have forced us to reevaluate our entire approach to military working dogs and their handlers. The bond we witnessed between Master Sergeant Mitchell and Shadow wasn't just impressive, it was illuminating." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, now sitting on Mitchell's side of the courtroom, nodded in agreement. The Department of Defense had completely reversed its position, using the attempted attack as a catalyst for sweeping policy changes. The criminal investigation into the organization that attempted to steal Shadow is ongoing, Martinez continued, but their actions have inadvertently sparked a national conversation about how we treat our military working dogs and the handlers who work with them. Sarah Chen stood, addressing the court with the confidence of someone who knew they were on the right side of history. Your Honor, in the past week, we've received statements of support from military and law enforcement agencies across the globe. The video footage from this courtroom showing Shadow's extraordinary abilities and his unbreakable bond with Master Sergeant Mitchell has become a catalyst for change. The judge nodded, lifting a thick document from her bench. I have here the new guidelines being implemented by the Department of Defense, with input from veterinary professionals, animal behaviorists, and military experts. These guidelines recognize that the bond between handler and dog is not just an emotional attachment, it is a crucial component of national security. Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. Captain Torres entered the courtroom, now dressed in his formal uniform. He carried a leather folder stamped with the seal of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your Honor, Torres addressed the court, I've been authorized to share previously classified information about the program that identified exceptional handler-dog partnerships like Mitchell and Shadow. He opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents that told a story of remarkable discoveries. What we learned from studying their bond has revolutionized our understanding of canine intelligence and human-animal cooperation. Mitchell listened as Torres explained how Shadow's abilities had helped reshape military working dog protocols. The dog pressed against his leg, a gesture of reassurance they had shared countless times in combat. This touch, this simple connection, had saved lives and would now help protect future handler dog teams. The older Vietnam veteran who had spoken to them last week stood up from his place in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may? At the judge's nod, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. What happened in this courtroom last week wasn't just about one handler and his dog. It was about recognizing something we dog handlers have known all along. These animals are more than partners. They're family. Judge Martinez smiled, understanding lighting her eyes. Family, she repeated, testing the word. That brings me to my ruling. She straightened in her chair, assuming the full mantle of her authority. In the matter of the custody of the military working dog designated Shadow, this court finds that the bond between handler and dog transcends traditional concepts of military property. She paused, letting her words sink in. Shadow's actions last week demonstrated not just extraordinary training, but a level of intelligence, loyalty, and dedication that cannot be measured by standard metrics. The attempted theft of Shadow and the subsequent revelation of his crucial role in preventing a terrorist attack have made it clear that separating him from Master Sergeant Mitchell would not only be cruel, it would be against the interests of national security. Mitchell's hand found Shadow's fur, feeling the subtle shift of muscle as the dog remained alert, yet calm. They had faced death together countless times, saved each other in ways that went beyond physical protection. This moment, this recognition of their bond, felt like a victory not just for them, but for every handler and dog who had ever served together. Therefore, Martinez continued, it is the ruling of this court that Shadow shall remain in the permanent custody of Master Sergeant James Mitchell. Furthermore, this court recommends that the Department of Defense implement the new guidelines for military working dogs immediately, recognizing these extraordinary animals as more than equipment, as essential personnel whose bonds with their handlers must be protected and preserved. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Shadow's attention remained fixed on Mitchell. In that moment, their connection spoke volumes, not of legal victories or policy changes, but of a partnership that had been forged in fire and proven unbreakable. Sarah. Chen approached them, her eyes bright with triumph. "This ruling will change everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every military working dog, every handler, they'll all benefit from what you two proved here." Torres joined them, adding his own perspective. "The program will continue studying exceptional partnerships like yours," he explained, "but now with a different goal. Instead of trying to replicate or transfer these abilities, we'll focus on understanding how to nurture and support them." Mitchell looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of those who had witnessed this transformation. The veterans who understood the depth of the handler-dog bond, the military personnel who had seen their own perspectives changed, the legal professionals who had helped reshape the law to recognize what had always been true. "Shadow," Mitchell said softly, and the Belgian Malinois turned to meet his gaze. In those deep brown eyes, Mitchell saw the same unwavering loyalty that had guided them through firefights and ambushes, through rehabilitation and recovery, through every challenge life had thrown at them. Judge Martinez descended from her bench, approaching them with a warm smile. "You know," she said, watching Shadow's protective yet gentle demeanor with Mitchell, "in all my years on the bench, I've never seen anything quite like what you two showed us. This wasn't just about changing laws or setting precedents. This was about recognizing something profound about loyalty, trust, and the bonds that define us." The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, catching the medal on Shadow's vest and making it gleam. Outside, the world was already changing. New policies being implemented, old prejudices being questioned, and a deeper understanding of the handler-dog bond taking root. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered to Mitchell and Shadow. They had come to this courtroom expecting a final goodbye, and instead had found a new beginning. Their partnership, tested in combat and proven in crisis, would now help shape the future for other handlers and their dogs. Shadow's ear twitched, catching some distant sound, and Mitchell smiled. Some things would never change. His partner would always be vigilant, always protective, always ready. But now they faced the future together, their bond recognized and protected by the very institutions that had once threatened to separate them. As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Mitchell realized that their story wasn't just about keeping Shadow. It was about proving that some partnerships transcend ordinary understanding, that loyalty and trust can overcome any obstacle, and that the deepest bonds are forged not in moments of peace, but in the crucible of shared challenges. Shadow walked beside Mitchell's wheelchair as they exited the courthouse, both of them bathed in warm sunlight. They moved, as they always had, in perfect synchronization, each aware of the other's every movement. Their future stretched out before them, no longer shadowed by uncertainty, but bright with the promise of continued partnership. The doors of Courtroom 7A closed behind them, but the impact of what had happened there would echo for years to come, changing lives and protecting bonds between handlers and dogs across the nation. For Mitchell and Shadow, though, it was simpler than that. They were together, as they had always been meant to be, their bond stronger than any force that had tried to break it, and that in the end was all that mattered. If this story of unbreakable loyalty between a soldier and his dog touched your heart, make sure you don't miss our future inspiring tales. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to join our community of storytellers and story lovers. Each week we bring you remarkable true stories that remind us of the extraordinary bonds we share. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about Mitchell and Shadow's incredible journey. Until next time, remember that the strongest partnerships are forged in the face of adversity.